Thanks, Eileen, and thanks everybody for already a really amazing panel. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri country, and I pay my respects to elders, ancestors and warriors past and present. I think it's absolutely worth mentioning that displacement, dispossession and housing insecurity is first and foremost felt by First Nations peoples across this country and across this continent. And in our union, we pay that respect and we acknowledge our commitment to the continued struggle for decolonisation in projects like paying the rent, and including this week, obviously, with Sorry Day, seeing the continued displacement of children from their homes and from their homelands. I want to acknowledge that that's a continued struggle. And yes, Eileen, as you've mentioned, we're facing an ever-growing housing crisis, and we did form in one of the most challenging periods, I think, of our lifetimes, to come up ahead with that and the greater challenges that we're facing today. And I'm sorry I don't have my slides, but I do want to say that at first foundational level, the housing crisis does stem from that stolen wealth of First Nations country, and it's been stolen by those who would seek to continue to make a profit off the lives and livelihoods and land of this country as well. And we're talking about the basic right to shelter, and that's at the root of the housing crisis. And we're seeing that particularly now with down in Naarm, the lockdown again starting. So we're facing a lockdown again while those safety nets that we experienced have been lifted, and we're seeing the effects of people facing rent increases yet again with the threat of eviction once more. And this whole last year has shown us that the right to a home and the safety and shelter that we need is one of the crucial aspects of a healthcare response, not only to this pandemic, but for the broader sense of welfare and basic rights that we all should have, particularly in this country. So in saying that, the government, both at a federal and state level, have chosen to cut safety nets, and particularly this federal government has done exactly that. And low-income folks have felt those effects for a very long time, compounding down further and further. And yet now increasingly more and more people are faced with being locked out of their homes, out of a completely unregulated, unfettered market that we're expected to continue to pay for. And we've continued to have to pay for this crisis more broadly. And Alison, as Alison has mentioned, we did see this about 100 years ago. There was a similar global pandemic followed by a similar depression, followed by mass evictions, and renters, unemployed workers, and workers more broadly took mass scale action and caused the true defense of each other's right to a home. They tied up sheriffs and they demonstrated what would happen to a cop or a landlord for trying to evict them. And through that fight, they eventually won welfare. They won Social Security Act, and they won the protections that come with those payments and that welfare. And we saw what is basically the last national housing policy that this country's ever seen in 1945. And it shows that we don't have one now. And we are in a complete national crisis in terms of the housing and homelessness issues. And the state and federal governments need to start treating it like one. Absolutely. So what we've done over the last 12 months of being a union is to push for those demands for the improvement and the expansion of public housing. And it's not just a state-by-state answer or solution or responsibility. That's a federal government responsibility. And yet again, in this budget, we've seen that they haven't given that any time. We've also pushed very hard for COVID-19 rental debt to be waived. Our members, particularly those with low income and those who are on temporary visas without income supports, have faced incredible eye-watering debt over the last 12 months because they've had no income to fall back on or welfare to fall back on. And including those on DSP payments who didn't see a COVID supplement, we're talking about extreme levels of debt that the federal government needed to have a solution for, and will continue to push until they do. We also need to see, in a longer term scale, legislation that will actually cap rents, control the market to some extent, because the market is not serving anybody except those who own and have the potential to own more. And of course, the response to that generally is that, what about landlords and their mortgages? And, you know, that's absolutely a very valid thing, particularly in this country. Our housing, our whole economy is propped up by a housing market. And by the idea of now, on average in Sydney and Melbourne, $1 million being the average price. So while the government tries to scrap responsible lending and tries to hand out more tax breaks and incentives to continue propping up that market, we're seeing 1 in 3 people who rent in this country pay for that, and pay for that assumed right of property ownership. So out of that 1 in 3 people in Australia, the 32% of the population, we are spending $43 billion a year of our wages to 1.3 million landlords. They're not just lucky enough to own their own home, but they're lucky enough in this lucky country to invest in a second, and increasingly more so a 4th and 5th investment home. And investment carries risk, and we know that the risks look different, and our members know and feel the risks much more intensely. While a landlord has to default potentially on a second investment, we're facing homelessness, and we're facing it increasingly more so. There's over 100,000 people on the waiting list now for public housing, and members of ours have been waiting for 25 years or more. So while there's negative gearing and incentives, at the base root of this, we're seeing our labour and the wages that we have increasingly go into paying rent. And now for people on DSP payments, that's looking more and more like 85% of their income. When the government talks about rental stress, they're saying that 30% of your income going to rent is considered rental stress. And these days, it's somewhere between 60 to 85%. In the last quarter of this year, they've found that there are only 3 houses available to someone on a single job seeker income. And that is literally 3 in the whole country. The idea that we could just survive on that alone is just abhorrent. So going to the budget that we've seen the federal government roll out this year, again, we've not seen a national housing policy. We've seen, as part of essential services, Senator Ruston announcing that $56.7 million of homelessness funding will remain. But that was after a previous threat of cutting it completely. And the fact that that's even there is because of the fights that ASU and other unions had years and years ago to make sure that people were being given the legal wage in terms of those public sector and social safety net access providing support worker wages. Like the basic living income, the basic legal wage is not something that we should be having to fight for. Yet again, we are. So what Senator Ruston has done this year is to compound that legal wage in that 56.7 million with a housing budget. So essentially they're expecting state governments to use what is basically 11 million per state to build public housing, which is just an incredibly abhorrent idea. And we know that public housing is a preventative measure in terms of healthcare and in terms of social safety nets. We've also seen that the promises of women's safety in this budget have been completely just unregarded compared to the spending that we've seen in defence, for example. If the government's going to be putting $1.1 billion into family violence, yet $270 billion into defence, that speaks volumes to the need and priorities and the difference between the two. And in terms of relying on the market and private incentives, this is absolutely what this budget's been about. It's further privatisation, it's further wealth development for the few and not the all. And increasingly, more and more of us are the people who need better. They've incentivised more first home buyers, yet exceedingly created further steep increases into housing unaffordability. We've seen the Treasurer state that regional Australia shouldn't be taken for granted. And after the bushfires, more and more people are still trying to rebuild themselves and their homes. And yet rent increases have continued. And we're seeing 25% in the last couple of months rise in regional areas. And many of our members are being pushed out of places like Ballarat and Geelong, Castlemaine and other areas where there's just no way they can afford to live in their hometowns anymore. And the federal government at root is clearly demonstrating a choice to prioritise that profit-driven market that serves those few and furthers the broken housing system that we're currently living through. So if I can just sort of wrap up on the last thought, that we're probably not going to see anything better from this government, and it doesn't mean that we don't push harder. But it does mean that we need to think more broadly about how we can connect our struggles together, how we can work with unions, how we can build our own wealth, essentially, and our own ability for the public good, because that's exactly what we need to be doing, and we need to be doing it fast. Thank you.